Hello, everybody, and welcome to Charts with Dan. We're going up a little bit later than usual. Thank you for your patience. I usually go up on Monday afternoon. It is Tuesday morning as this video is uploading, and it's because, despite the fact that I kept pushing this big review project that I was working on later and later, I kept going down a little weird, you know me in numbers, I just can't stop myself. So I had to give myself a little bit of extra time to get finished, but I do have it now. That's what we're going to be talking about as the main subject today, as well as looking at the box office for the past weekend and everything else. But I'm very excited to get into what I found, looking at the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, not just as a whole, but looking at them by segment, by when they're released and when they're published, if there's any change based on when a review is uploaded. This is all inspired by Wonder Woman 1984, that strange pattern that we're going to look at again in a few minutes of how the movie's reviews dropped. It currently sits at rotten 59%, although as I was calculating things, it's at 59.4%. So if one positive review comes in for Wonder Woman 1984 or two, then I think it would flip back to fresh at 60%. We're going to break down all of those numbers. There's some really interesting things that I found, and also just kind of some answers to questions or different things that were raised in the wake of the whole Wonder Woman 1984 thing. So we will get to that in just a few minutes, but there were a couple things I wanted to do. First of all, I wanted to lead off the show, and it seems like it's been a trend this year, but it is a sad trend and it is part of life, by recognizing somebody who passed away just a few days ago, Christopher Plummer, a legendary actor, an Academy Award winner, and someone who excelled in movies across pretty much every genre, passed away last week. He was known to so many people for so many different reasons. I first saw him in the Dan Aykroyd, Tom Hanks comedy Dragnet when I grew up. Most people probably saw him for the first time in The Sound of Music, one of the great classic musicals of all time, but he was in a Star Trek movie as General Chang in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. As I mentioned, he won an Academy Award for Beginners. He was in Knives Out, a movie that it was popular when it came out, and it has even grown in popularity. He acted across multiple decades, and his star remained bright the entire time. It's rare for you to see an actor working at such a high caliber. He had last picked up an Oscar nomination for All the Money in the World, which he stepped into at the very last minute and put in a great performance. He truly was somebody who, if you saw him in a film, you knew that he was going to bring everything, every bit of talent he had to bear in that role. So Christopher Plummer, truly a Hollywood legend, someone who will continue to live in his work for many, many decades to come, gone just a few days ago at age 91. So let us turn to the box office this past weekend. It was a sleepy box office, as it has been the past many, many weekends. And the number one movie, once again, was The Little Things. It had a drop off around 55%. These are not final numbers because Warner Brothers isn't providing final numbers. We've talked about that before. We do know, though, that it is still the number one film. The Croods: A New Age, still hanging in there. It's been in theaters since Thanksgiving. It is still the number two movie, $1.6 million. Then we drop below $1 million. The Marksman actually moving up one place to the third spot. Wonder Woman 1984 continuing to fade back one spot at number 4, and Monster Hunter at number 5, still hanging around in the top 5. Let's see what this does for our 2021 charts. Domestically, The Marksman remains the number one film of the year with $9.1 million, followed by The Little Things. I thought that it might surpass it this week. It did not. It looks like perhaps it will this next week, although the box office is very sluggish. At number 3, still, as we dip below $1 million, Our Friend at $588,000. The re-release of The Emperor's New Groove is the number 4 film of the year. Then Supernova, which moves up a couple spots to number 5. A re-release of Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring debuts on the charts at number 6, and a re-release of Groundhog Day debuts on the charts at number 7. The re-release of Alien drops 3 spots to number 8. The newest Studio Ghibli film, Earwig and the Witch, which is also available on HBO Max, is at number 9 on the charts with $132,768. So even Studio Ghibli not getting a whole lot of people out to the theater, although it's not playing as widely as many other films. And then No Man's Land drops 2 spots to the number 10 spot. Dropping out of the chart, once again, is the re-release of Jurassic World, the re-release of Sing, the re-release of Remember the Titans, and the re-release of Abominable. A lot of films dropping out of the top 10 chart for 2021, although this week, all re-release films. Let's look at the worldwide chart for 2021, and as has been a trend, they're very fluid, they keep fluctuating, and that's because it is very difficult to get reliable information. Big Red Envelope, which had been reported at a certain number last week, was downgraded this week from all the sources I could find, so it drops down below Master. Master retakes the number one spot, the film from India, with $37.3 million. In the third spot, the Russian film The Last Warrior, Root of Evil. Then Wish Dragon and Soul, two Chinese films, at numbers 4 and 5. The Dry from Australia stays at number 6. The Little Things moves up 1 to number 7. Gintama The Final moves up 2 spots to number 8. The Marksman drops 2 spots to number 9. And then another Indian film named Crack, which did not have figures reported, is now reporting about $10 million, so that puts it in at number 10. Dropping off the charts is Octonauts The Ring of Fire. However, this chart is going to light up next week because as we go into this week, we are entering the New Year's celebration in China. And this is notable for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it's the biggest box office weekend in the world traditionally for the last few years. There is a huge surge at the box office in China. This year seems to be no different. There are still attendance restrictions in parts of China, so it's not going to be quite as big as perhaps years past, but there is going to be a box office extravaganza happening in China. And it's also one of the first anniversaries for me of sorts when we talk about the pandemic and everything that's been going on, because if you go back, way back to a different state and a different job for me, when I was doing a version of this show over on Fandom Entertainment, the first time I think that I actually covered anything having to do with the pandemic was when I discussed the fact that China had canceled all of its movie releases for the New Year weekend, which is what we're coming up on this week. And that was the first indication to me as a box office guy that this was a bigger deal than even we had known about at the time. We're in it for the long haul, and I think it's kind of like the frog in the boiling water. We didn't quite know how in it for the long haul we were, but we are. And so the first of many different anniversaries marking how long we have been doing, and I've been covering this thing from a box office perspective, is coming up this weekend. Prepare to look at these charts next weekend and see a lot of big numbers, and it really is going to cement the fact that this worldwide chart is going to be absolutely dominated by Chinese films for the very near future, because there is no way that any domestic release is going to come close to any of the grosses that we're going to see upcoming from the New Year's celebration and the New Year weekend in China anytime soon. So let's move on to something that I've spent quite a bit of time on in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and that is a follow-up to some reporting that I did back when Wonder Woman 1984 came out. If you'll recall, right at the beginning of the release cycle for Wonder Woman 1984, the reviews before the movie came out were overwhelmingly positive. They were so positive, in fact, that Rotten Tomatoes gave Wonder Woman 1984 the certified fresh label at 89% with 82 reviews in. Well, what happened? We saw a big dip in reviews as the film was released. It first lost that certified fresh title. It then lost its fresh rating. As I mentioned, it is just barely edged down into rotten territory right now. It may not settle there. We will see. And so I did an episode that was very well viewed, and thank you if you watched that episode, talking about the drop in that rating and the fact that it is because there was an abnormally high drop from the reviews that came out before the film came out on embargo day to when people actually saw it, when the reviews that came out on the release day and the days afterward. And a lot of people had questions about why that was. Is this a common thing? And it's something I didn't really have the answers to. So I decided to do a little bit of investigation, look at the Rotten Tomatoes reviews that have come in for big films, and see if I could answer some of these questions. Because a lot of people, honestly, had theories that critics give good reviews to these big movies because they want to maintain their access. And that's what happened with Wonder Woman 1984, that, it wasn't necessarily critics that liked the film. It was that they didn't want to lose that access to early screenings. And I thought, well, I've actually never really sat down and looked at these numbers. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe you do see an abnormally high number of positive reviews, particularly when critics see it in time to drop first when the embargo is lifted. And maybe you do see a drop down that's very common between that date and when the movie comes out. So I decided to do a little bit of research, and I actually did it in a couple of phases. And the first phase that I tried actually turned out to be a little too broad. So one thing that I did measure, and that you are going to see the numbers for today, is I took the 10 highest grosses of each year from 2015 to 2019. So that's 5 years worth of data. I did not include 2020 because, as we just talked about, it was a very abnormal box office year, and I wanted to look at what the box office looks like when it is operating at full steam. So I looked at 5 years of data. I took the 10 highest grossing films from those 5 years and then looked at the reviews for those movies. There are some other special selection movies that I did to test different theories and different cases, etc. We'll look at those later. But for all of the movies, I first decided to kind of break everything down into 3 major phases. Pre-release, which would be the embargo day and any reviews that came out before the movie was released. Then the week of release, and then post-release, which is anything a week or more after the film came out. And what I found was that the data was actually pretty stable. Of those 50 films, 82% or 41 of the 50 films analyzed did not deviate any more or less than 5% from the final tomato meter across all 3 stages. So when I say that it didn't deviate any more or less than 5% from the final tomato meter, this is what I mean. If a film had a final score right now of 80%, meaning 80% of critics that saw it gave it a positive review, across all of those different stages, pre-release, week of release, and post-release, critics never gave it less than 75% or more than 85%. There wasn't a huge deviation from that 80%. So the numbers were pretty stable. There wasn't a whole lot to dig down into as far as big deviations, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking at the Wonder Woman 1984 data, and we're looking for any other movies that might have these big deviations, big drops, big spikes. So instead of the 3 big phases, being me, I divided it down even more. So here are the different ways that we're going to look at this data today. As I mentioned, I looked mainly at the 10 highest grossers from each year, from 2015 to 2019, with some special cases that I will point out as we go. And the reviews were broken out into these different segments. Embargo day, meaning the day that critics are allowed to publish their reviews. They have seen the movie early. Then the pre-release window. That's any time after the embargo day, before the movie comes out. Then I looked at reviews that were released on the day of the film's release. That's a pretty large number because it's people that either saw the movie very late in that pre-release window or went the day that it opened. Then there's the week of release, which is pretty much up to 7 days after the release day, and then post-release, 8 days after release to present. Now, a couple of caveats. Average scores and ratings were not taken into account, just the fresh rotten ratio, and that's important to remember, and it's something that I kind of breeze over and try not to with Rotten Tomatoes. This is not how highly the critics rated this film. This is only whether a critic liked it or did not like it. It is a binary system. Keep that in mind. This is not how much a critic liked a movie, it's just whether or not they liked it. And as always, a caveat, the results don't always reflect the day that the reviews were originally published. For example, some reviews are submitted to Rotten Tomatoes after publication, which means that somebody may have originally written or done their YouTube review on release day, but they did not upload it or give it to Rotten Tomatoes until the day after. Rotten Tomatoes is largely a self-submission system. Time and manpower being as it is, I could not individually go into each review and confirm when it was published or uploaded. I do think that this is a pretty representative sample size. We could go more granular into detail later. That'll be a lot more time and a lot more energy, but maybe if we want to go even deeper into this, we can. So, looking at these 5 phases, embargo day, the pre-release window, release day, the week of release, and then post-release, let's look at the pattern that we were looking at with Wonder Woman 1984 and why it was so irregular. So here's that pattern plotted out by the tomato meter, which is the number of fresh reviews versus the number of rotten reviews. As you can see, on embargo day for Wonder Woman 1984, it got 88% positive reviews. In the pre-release window, so after that embargo day, before the film was released, that number dropped to 63%. That is a massive drop. That's a 25-point drop. It is very rare to see anything like that. As you can see on release day, that number dropped another 13%. So on release day, 50-50. For every good review that Wonder Woman got, it got a bad review. By the time that the release week rolled around, it was 40% positive. So 6 out of 10 reviews were negative for Wonder Woman 1984. It has rebounded in the post-release window. So reviews that came out a week or more after the movie was released are at 52%, so slightly more positive, but still rotten at 52. And it's this downward slope that we're looking for to see if there's anything that can kind of replicate what happened with Wonder Woman 1984, because this is very unusual. It is very unusual to see a film drop like that, from such high heights to such low lows. Luckily, even though the critical response has been mixed, the DC films released by Warner Brothers have largely been in that group of the top 10 grossers for the last 5 years. So let's see if there were any swings with the other DC films released by Warner Brothers that have a similar pattern, a very high start and a very big dip as more people saw the film. And let's start with one that also had a very unusual pattern, Joker, which was released in 2019. On its embargo day, it got 86% positive reviews. However, we saw a similar drop. The pre-release window, those reviews dropped down to 67%. That's almost 20%. So it's a very similar drop to what we saw from Wonder Woman 1984 between embargo day and the reviews that were written after embargo but before the film's release. But here is the difference. When we get to release day, those reviews did not continue to drop. As a matter of fact, it jumped up a little bit to 70%. Then on release week, we had a dip again to 62%. And post-release, those have gone back up to 69%. It's really only similar in that dip from the very, very, very first reviews that came out on embargo day and the ones that dipped in that pre-release window. Then it sort of leveled off or kind of, went up. We see this a lot. A movie will come out of a film festival with big buzz, big reviews, and then when more critics see it, you see that dip. That's not unusual. Also, I think it's worth noting that, yes, we did see a dip, a big dip, from the initial reviews to that kind of second round of reviews. Many people held Joker in very high regard. It is an Oscar-winning film. So that drop even, with Wonder Woman 1984, critics were kind of put on the hot seat by a lot of folks for rating it so highly in those embargo reviews. With Joker, many critics were put on the hot seat for rating it so low in that second window. That's not really confirming any of the kind of the pattern that we saw with Wonder Woman 1984. Yes, you have that one drop, but then the movie kind of levels out. So let's keep looking at some other Warner Brothers films, maybe some that were not critically well received. Were there early reviews that perhaps were exceptionally high for some of the ones that other critics generally didn't care for? Well, let's look at Suicide Squad. Suicide Squad's embargo day reviews were 36%. That there was a 14-point drop between embargo day to the other pre-release reviews at 22%, and a little bit of a drop to reviews on release day at 19%. Now, the week of release, those review numbers went back up to 31%. So people that actually largely saw the movie in theaters or saw it when it was released regarded it higher than some of the pre-release critics, regarded it higher than those that had seen it on the day of its release. It's second only to the embargo day critics, and then post-release it settled down a little bit to 27%. So yes, Suicide Squad's first round of reviews were definitely a little more positive than the other ones, but not substantially more so. And if we're looking at kind of confirmation of this theory that critics are going to give a big studio movie from Warner Brothers, much like Wonder Woman 1984 was, a positive review when it doesn't deserve one, we see slightly more positivity on Suicide Squad there, but not a drastic amount more. Let's look at another film that was not particularly well received critically, Batman v Superman. 34% reviews on embargo day. That dipped a little bit to 30% pre-release. Release day was 30%. It dropped to 22% on release week, and then post-release, it's dropped around 26%. So again, we see a slightly higher number, about 4% higher for that first wave of reviews on embargo day, but again, not a drastic drop. This is something that repeats itself when you look at Aquaman. Aquaman actually had 74% fresh reviews on embargo day. Then pre-release, 65% fresh. Release day, that dipped to 51%. That's in rotten territory. But look at this rebound. On release week, it went up from 51% on release day to 68%, which means that the people that saw it in theaters the week that it came out loved it a lot more than the people that either saw it the day that it was released or published their reviews on the day that it was released. And then post-release, it settled around 67%. You see the beginning of that dip, but then it recovers. It is not like Wonder Woman 1984, where it's kind of a big decline like this and then a bit of a jump at the end as far as the post-release reviews. I would also like to point out, having been one of those critics that gave it a negative review, people were very, very unhappy with a lot of the critics who gave Aquaman poor reviews, especially after it came out. So I think public sentiment also did not match. There was no criticism of critics that I read or heard that they were too high on Aquaman at the beginning. When reviews dipped, it was kind of the opposite. There was a backlash against critics who gave it a negative review. Let's look at Wonder Woman. If Wonder Woman 1984 seemed like it had a bit of an inflated beginning, did the original Wonder Woman have the same thing? Well, no. The first Wonder Woman was actually remarkably consistent. 96% on embargo day, 92% pre-release, 97% the day it was released, a dip to 87% on release week, and then post-release, it has jumped back up to 93%. Looking at the different theories about what could have happened with Wonder Woman 1984, it does not really appear that this was a thing with critics wanting to maintain access to DC films or maintain access to Warner Brothers films, or at least the data does not show a trend that way. It does show that embargo day reviews were slightly more enthusiastic on a lot of these films, but that was also in line with enthusiasm at other points in those films' releases. And as we look more and more into embargo days, it's not necessarily specific to any one studio or movie. That's something we'll address a little bit later on. So as we go on and try to figure out if there's a pattern between Wonder Woman 1984, if there has been any other movie that replicated this performance, let's move on to away from critics perhaps giving a higher rating initially to a Warner Brothers or a DC film, and perhaps moving on to the female lead. Obviously, that is a big thing, a much hyped thing, particularly with the first Wonder Woman film. Are there big Hollywood movies that have gotten the same kind of pop early, where it seems like critics may perhaps be giving it credit for the fact that it has a female lead or a female director? We saw the results with Wonder Woman, that there was not a substantially higher rating at the beginning, but Wonder Woman was a pretty good movie. Let's look at another movie that did very well at the box office, but which people also kind of question critics on, and that is Captain Marvel, the first female-led superhero film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As you can see, embargo day reviews on Captain Marvel were at 81%. That was exactly in line with the other reviews that came out before the film was released at 81%. Then you did see a dip from 81 to 72%, so a 9% drop on release day. But look, that rebounds to 78% the week of release, and then post-release, that has stayed at around 79%. That again holds with the pattern that we're seeing with embargo day and pre-release reviews being a little higher. You see a little dip around the day of release, but then a rebound, this kind of U-shaped curve. We've seen it several times now. Let's look at another movie, and I'm loath to bring it up, but I think that this would be something that people would ask about. This was not a top 10 hit of the year, but this was also a movie that was very much in discussion because of its female leads, and I'm talking about Ghostbusters 2016. Was there a substantial difference in critical reaction to Ghostbusters 2016 before it came out as opposed to when it was released and more critics were able to see it? As you can see, on embargo day for Ghostbusters 2016, the film got 76% fresh reviews. That stayed consistent throughout pre-release. Those reviews also were at 76%. And then we saw another dip, a 12% dip on release day to 64%, but it's very much like Captain Marvel. There was a dip on release day. We saw a little bit of a recovery the week following release at 67%, and then post-release, the reaction to Ghostbusters 2016 has matched the embargo day and the pre-release numbers with 76% fresh. So we did see a 12% dip on release day, but it has rebounded. Again, that U-shaped curve. We've not yet seen that same curve that we saw in Wonder Woman 1984 that started here and then declined so much. So far, it is a unique event. Let's look at a film that was much hyped for having a female director that was not a critical hit and really not a financial hit, and that is A Wrinkle in Time, which is directed by Ava DuVernay. That received 44% positive reviews on the embargo day, which dipped to 40% pre-release, 38% on release day. Then release week was actually the low at 31%, but post-release, that has actually dipped up. Critics that published reviews more than a week after the film's release are the highest on A Wrinkle in Time, even higher than embargoed critics at 46%. So again, we do not see anything that indicates that embargoed critics were any more enthusiastic about this film than they normally are for any other film. It is slightly more elevated, but we again see that dip and then a recovery. It doesn't appear that superhero films that are led by females or female-led films or female-directed films, at least not the notable examples that I've pulled here, have followed a pattern that's anything close to Wonder Woman 1984. So let's look at another factor, which is the access factor. And the one studio that people generally focus on more than anything is Disney. A lot of folks I've heard have theories that critics give Disney movies good reviews or good early reviews because they fear losing their access. Let's look at some of those movies, and I'm just pushing all the buttons here. Let's look at how reviews broke out for The Last Jedi. Now, from one perspective, this is, I guess you could say, the closest to the Wonder Woman 1984 curve in that it does dip at every different phase. However, you do not see the dramatic dip that you saw in Wonder Woman 1984. So, The Last Jedi received 94% fresh reviews on embargo day. Moving into the pre-release window, that dropped down 1% to 93%. On release day, those reviews were 90%. The week after release, 88%, and then post-release, 85%. So there has been a very gradual slide over time with The Last Jedi, which is now a film that's over 3 years old. But that slide has been less than 10%. Again, I think a lot of people consider they don't like The Last Jedi, and that's fine. And you don't have to agree with critics, that's for sure. But there was not a huge critical backlash to that film. You're not seeing a number where a bunch of critics saw the movie and repudiated the critics that had seen it early. Let's look at The Rise of Skywalker. I mentioned The Rise of Skywalker is one of those movies that had a big drop. Embargo day reviews for Rise of Skywalker were 57%. That is just under the fresh rating, which is 60%. That dipped a little bit in the pre-release window to 54%. Release day reviews were actually a little bit higher at 56%. Then reviews dropped to 45% the week of release. And as I mentioned, post-release, the reviews have gotten lower at 37%. So there is a 20-point drop between embargo day and post-release. That's the biggest drop that we've seen. However, again, 57% is not a fresh rating. If that number had been 77 or 87%, then I think we'd be looking at what seems to be kind of a very odd drop from the very high highs to the very low lows. Keep in mind that 20-point drop is what happened with Wonder Woman 1984 between the embargo day and the time the movie came out. That's not what we're seeing. What we are seeing is that more than usual, people are souring on The Rise of Skywalker, and critics have been giving it more negative reviews over time than gave it positive reviews at the very beginning of its life cycle. There are some Star Wars films also that kind of defy this pattern. Rogue One, a Star Wars story, had embargoed reviews at 84%. That rose in the pre-release window to 87, dropped on release day to 76, but Rogue One was actually the most popular the week of its release. After all of the critics, the early access critics, had seen and reviewed the movies, it was the critics who submitted reviews that probably saw it in theaters that liked it the most at 90%. That's dropped to 81% post-release. I think you can have that discussion about why the numbers are a little bit higher at the beginning of the life cycle for a Star Wars movie. But again, you can't point to that movie as this movie is like what we saw with Wonder Woman 1984. However, there was one movie that I looked at that was a top 10 hit, and that did have a decline that was very similar in the first three phases to Wonder Woman 1984, and that kind of opened up a new universe or a new avenue for me to look at, and that's Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Embargo day reviews were at 68%. Then pre-release, that drops to 52%, so you see a 16% drop-off. That drops off another 19% on release day. It had 33% fresh reviews. Now, there was a rebound. On release week, 44%, so an 11% increase. But this is the closest that I found so far to a movie that replicates what Wonder Woman 1984 has done, which is you start with a higher number of reviews. Now, if you'll notice, the highest that Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom got was 68. Wonder Woman 1984 was 88. So it never got the number of fresh reviews that Wonder Woman 1984 got as far as percentages go. The highest number it got was 68% of critics giving it a good review. But still, this drop-off that you see is very close. So that got me kind of looking into another thing. I've been looking at the big hits, the top 10 grossers, and the reason that I chose that is because I thought, well, if it's about access, if it's about critics kind of pumping up the big movies because they don't want to lose that access, then I'm going to want to look at the big movies because those are the ones that the studios are going to want to have the biggest reviews for, the best reviews for. Those are the most expensive movies. Those are the tentpoles. I don't see the evidence here that early critics are giving a big boost to these movies because you're not seeing that decline. You're seeing some decline sometimes, but that's usually followed by an improvement. So maybe it's because a lot of these big movies are well-reviewed movies. They're good movies by most people's estimation, so you're not going to see these big declines. Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, on the other hand, was not a well-reviewed movie, but it did still have a pretty high embargo day score. So could the case be that early critics, particularly ones that see the film first, are artificially heightening these scores, and that it's exposed when a film is not well received, like Wonder Woman 1984. So you do see these high embargo day scores that decline as the movie goes, and then that decline just continues because the movie's not well received. I wanted to investigate that further, so I went back and I found the highest grossing movie in each of the years I was looking at, which was 2015 to 2019, that was somewhere in the 50s. When we look at a movie that's in the 50s on Rotten Tomatoes, that is a rotten movie, but it's very mediocre. If you're of the mindset that there are critics out there, particularly early critics, that are giving positive scores to movies that quote unquote don't deserve them, or are going to pump up a movie's numbers because they want to keep that access, you would think that you would see that highlighted on movies that weren't well regarded, because those early critics are still giving good scores, but the other critics are giving very bad scores. You're going to see that high drop down to that low. We did see that with Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. So I went and found some others that seem to qualify. One of those movies is Minions, which came out in 2015. However, you do not see that drop. Pre-release, 59% of critics gave the film a fresh rating. Now, the embargo day was actually very small. There was only 1 or 2 reviews. So this encompasses the very few reviews that came out on embargo date, plus the ones that came out before the film was released. So 59% pre-release. That number actually went up. On release day, more critics gave it a positive rating than the ones that saw it pre-release at 65%. That dropped to 45% on release week, but then it recovered to 58% post-release. So you do not see evidence of a big positive critical reaction that drops suspiciously low. As a matter of fact, Minions recovered from a drop in critical opinion. Let's look at another movie, Home, that came out in 2015 that's right in the middle. You do see, again, pre-release, the critics that saw it first, 44%. That went up 14 points on release day to 58%. That dropped on release week to 40%. But when you look post-release, the critical response has flipped from rotten to fresh. So by far, by 19 points over the first critics to see the film, critics that have reviewed Home after it came out have liked it way more, 19 points more at 63%. So we don't see that pattern with Home. Another film, Jason Bourne, not well received. Do we see that pattern? Well, we do see that there was a pretty fairly positive reception at 66% on the embargo day, but that did drop 14 percentage points in that pre-release window. So the first critics that saw Jason Bourne did like it more. As a matter of fact, that's a fresh score. That pre-release score is a rotten score. If that had continued to drop, we could be looking at another piece of evidence, perhaps that it was an artificially inflated score, that there were some critics that were trying to curry favor. However, look at release day. The number goes back up to 58%. Release week, 61%. And then there's a big drop post-release. But again, we don't see what I think is clear evidence of critics boosting a score for a movie that doesn't deserve it. The Boss Baby. It was least popular with critics who saw it first. 42% when the film dropped its embargo liked the film. That actually jumped up 26 points on release day to 68%. It stayed fresh on release week at 64%. Now that's dropped post-release. But the critics that saw The Boss Baby first, not only did they not boost up the score, they hated the movie more than any other group of critics that saw it. The same can be said for The Equalizer 2. On embargo day, the critics that saw the movie before anybody else gave it 36%. That jumped up 25 points to 61% for critics that reviewed it after the embargo day but before it came out. That number went down to 50% on release day, 53% on release week, and then it stayed again post-release. So big Denzel Washington summer action movie. The first critics to see it hated it more than any other group of critics. And then finally, a movie that was very, again, in the middle in the 50s called Escape Room. You see, again, this is the only other movie that we've seen that has at least a curve that you could say is similar to Wonder Woman 1984 in that it declines over time, but not by that much. Embargo day reviews, which was the day before the movie came out, never a great sign. We're at 56%. The next day, on release day, that dropped 2 points. The week of release, it dropped 4 points. Post-release, 48 points, but less than a 10% difference, which means that early critics were very mediocre on the film. Every other group of critics that had seen it, also very mediocre on the film. So I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but really what we're looking for, and what I was looking for doing this is there a smoking gun that appears to show that, as many have alleged when they saw the reviews for Wonder Woman 1984, that there are critics, particularly the earliest critics, who will give a movie a positive review so that they don't lose access to other movies from that studio. I do not see an indication there, because you would think that we would have seen another movie, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom is the closest that we got, that would have that the same thing would have happened, that this would have been exposed, that these critics would have been exposed, that they were giving these positive reviews to these very not good movies. We've looked at the biggest movies from the last 5 years, or at least the last 5 years where the box office was operating normally. I cannot find another movie that has that same kind of pattern. So when I look at the findings here, what can I tell you? Well, I can tell you that of the movies that I analyzed, not one of them repeated the pattern of Wonder Woman 1984, where we saw a substantially higher percentage of positive reviews for the film at the embargo. We saw a massive drop from the embargo to the pre-release date, another massive drop from the pre-release date to the day of release, and then a continued drop to the week after release. I could not find another film that repeated this pattern. Now, there is something that needs to be said about embargo day reviews, and these are the reviews that are the very first ones that you see, the critics who get to see the film first. They are, on average, more positive. As a matter of fact, embargo day reviews on average were more positive for the 10 highest grossers from 2015 to 2019, 5.88% higher than the final tomato meter score for these films, and they were 7.15% higher than reviews published on release week. There is some truth to people saying that the early critics are more positive on a film, although certainly not to the degree that they thought when we were looking at Wonder Woman 1984. When you look at the 5 different phases that I broke down at the highest average ratings, the highest percentage of positive reviews tended to come on embargo day. Then, in the pre-release window, the reviews that came out after the embargo dropped, but before a film came out. But third was post-release, the reviews that were posted a week or more after the release of the film. Then release week, reviews that came out the week the movie came out, and the reviews that come out the day that a movie's released were actually the lowest rated. When you look at how reviews break down, there's certainly been some questions about, are reviews from people that see the movie early skewed positively? I think you could also ask the same question when you look at the 2 lowest ratings come from release week and then release day. Are the reviews from critics who review the films on the day the movie's released or afterwards a little lower? Is it possible they're a little less enthusiastic than their counterparts because they weren't able to see the film early? I think that's just as relevant a question to ask as if early critics that see the movie are more positive because they do get to see the film early. But one thing I do want to point out with critics, when people do say that they give a more positive review because they get to see the movie early, or they don't want to lose their access, so they say that a bad movie is good, you're calling into question their credibility. And I've said this many times before, but I am often lucky enough to be one of those voices that is in that embargo day window, or that window pre-release, that gets to see a movie early and gets to review a movie early before it comes out. I can say from my own personal opinion, that's never been the case with me. I've never softened my views on a movie. I've never flipped my review on a film because I was afraid to lose any kind of access that I've had. That's never been threatened to happen to me. I've never had a studio revoke my access because I gave a movie a bad review. I've given many movies a bad review. I've ravaged films, and the invitations keep coming from all of these different studios. And as I was doing this research, there are some critics that consistently pop up that see the films first because they have been writing for a long time. They're well established in the critical field. I don't know all of them. I can't speak to everyone's motivation, but I can say that a lot of the faces I saw, I did know. And another thing that I think drives someone to become a successful film critic is that they love movies. They're passionate and enthusiastic about film and passionate and enthusiastic about cinema. I promise you, nobody misses movie theaters, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, nobody misses movie theaters than critics, because they have chosen to make movies their life. Is it that surprising that reviews that come from critics who have been established long enough, who are enthusiastic about film, who love cinema, who have worked their way into being able to be in that first group of critics to see a film, is it that surprising that maybe they like a lot of movies a little bit more than other critics? I think it is just as realistic to posit, or at least no less outlandish, that early critics, the ones that see films in embargo, it is just as likely that their scores are a little bit higher because they love movies just that much more, instead of being corrupt, instead of projecting some kind of a motivation that calls their credibility into question. I am a film critic and I'm very enthusiastic about movies. I go into every movie wanting to love it. I wish that every single movie was good, and I think the best critics have that same kind of mentality. And when you have critics that decide that they want every movie to be good, is it that hard to believe that maybe they find the best in every movie just that much more? Something to think about. Okay, let's wrap this up. I'm shocked if any of you stuck around. Let's take a look at when the box office was up and running, and we're going to go back to a flashback from 20 years ago, February 9th through 11th, 2001. Ridley Scott's Hannibal broke a February box office record at number one, 58 million in 2001 money. That's pretty impressive. The number one film at the box office, followed by the J-Lo Matthew McConaughey rom-com The Wedding Planner in its third week, in second place at $7.7 million. Saving Silverman in its first week, $7.4 million. Underrated performance comedically from Jack Black, and also Steve Zahn. It's just delightful. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon in its 10th week. People loved that movie. Plus, it was expanding as it went, $5.4 million. And then in its 8th week, Castaway from Robert Zemeckis and Tom Hanks. They're still in the top 5 at $5.1 million. Some other notable box office moments from week 6. Back in 1953, Disney's Peter Pan opened in theaters. In 1968, Planet of the Apes had its world premiere in New York City. It would roll out into theaters everywhere a couple months later. In 1974, Blazing Saddles hit theaters. It would go on to get 3 Oscar nominations. Mel Brooks would also release Young Frankenstein in 1974, one of the best 1-2 punches from any director ever. And then back in 2014, can you believe it? 7 years ago, the Lego Movie made the box office awesome. I've said it many times before. The Lego Movie is one of the times that I was the most wrong about a movie that I had a preconceived notion about. I was delighted to be proven wrong because I love that movie. I think it's a great one. Let's take a look at what people are watching at home, and we'll start with the Amazon charts. News of the World still tops the charts. Premium video on demand at number 1. Let Him Go, which we've seen as a box office film and then as a PVOD film, is now open as a rental, and it is there at number 2. So people that perhaps did not rent it premium or did not buy it or did not go to the box office to see it can now rent and watch it at home. It's there at number 2. Songbird rental at number 3. Greenland, you can still buy it. It's at number 4. John Wick Chapter 3 stays on the chart. Those Amazon folks, they love John Wick. Promising Young Woman, still in the pre-VOD window, is at number 6. Interstellar, Groundhog Day, Maze Runner, The Scorch Trials, and The Karate Kid, 1984's version, round out returning to the chart or showing back up on the chart after a week or 2 off. They are the final 4 films on Amazon. Some real classics there. I mean, Groundhog Day, that's no surprise. We just had Groundhog Day, but I'm glad people are watching it. It's a great film. Those are all good. Those are all worth your time. Let's see what people are watching on iTunes. Let Him Go is there at number 1. 2067 was a 99-cent rental. That's a recent film that people decided to pick up at a good bargain there. Then you have Tenet, Greenland, Promising Young Woman, The War with Grandpa, The Big Short. Wild Mountain Thyme is a recent release that has opened the buy rent window, so that jumps on the chart at number 8. News of the World is there at number 9, and Synchronic is at number 10. And finally, let's see what people are watching on Netflix. The Netflix series Firefly Lane is at number 1, and then Malcolm and Marie, which is getting some awards buzz for Zendaya. She's picked up some nominations in different groups, Critics' Choice, one of them. I'm happy to be a part of that group. That is there at number 2. Bridgerton, the Netflix series, continues to be a juggernaut at number 3. Then new episodes of The Sinner at number 4. All About the Benjamins, not a Netflix film, but it's there in the top 5, followed by Finding Ohana and The Dig, which are 2 Netflix films. Then Coco Melon, which is not a Netflix original series, but a series for the kids at number 8. Go Dog Go, a Netflix series for the kids at number 9. And then Space Sweepers, an original Netflix film, is at number 10. And that wraps up charts for today. Thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for being patient while I break down all these numbers and while I spout all those numbers at you. I hope that you learned something or you enjoyed it. Perhaps this will lead us down different roads, different avenues. I always think, like I say, box office to me is as much a sociological study as it is an economic study. It's about behavior, why people like what they do and don't like what they don't do, why they go see, and hopefully people will be going to see things in the very near future. There's a lot to break down. I appreciate you spending your time while I did this experiment. I'll be back next week to talk about something. Who knows? We'll see what happens at the box office. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to check out even more of what I'm doing, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. And I want to thank these supporters. These are some of my producer level patrons. We are about to dive into our movie club. We're also going to be doing commentaries. I've got one coming out for Scott Pilgrim versus the World that I'm very excited about. Our watch along is going to be this week. Lots of fun stuff that we're going to be doing. I can't wait to share that all with them, and I'd love for you to come and join us as well. And don't forget about my podcast, All My Movies, which you can find on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you like podcasts. You can also catch us on the Schmodown Entertainment Network every Wednesday afternoon. But most importantly, thank you for watching me here today. I'll see you next week, and until then, stay safe.